thank you so much. Welcome to our first session of the day. I'm delighted here to have three wonderful panelists. I'm sure we'll have an extremely vibrant discussion around issues of countering online hate speech. This is obviously a huge issue, not only in South Africa, but also across the continent. And it particularly is a serious and significant issue around election time. So I'd like to just ask, before I turn to the questions, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to just briefly introduce themselves and the work that they're doing in this area, specifically around South Africa's upcoming election. So I'll first hand it over to Dr.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Very good morning to everybody. My name is Spiso Zondo. I'm in the School of Communication here at the University of Johannesburg. And I'm just delighted to be here because conversation around hate speech is something that topic that I really found quite intriguing, especially given that we are heading towards the election. I want to just maybe take this time to ponder around what hate is before it becomes a speech.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tessa. I'm the Director of Programs at the Rivonia Circle. We are a political think tank, and we encourage people to exercise their political power and their political agency from grassroots communities all through the year, and especially on voting day.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Tumbo. I work at the South African Human Rights Commission, and I'm a senior researcher for equality working at the Commission. Obviously, being a Chapter 9, the Human Rights Commission plays a role in ensuring that human rights are not violated. And I'll speak a bit more about that as we get.
Great, thank you so much. So it's a wonderful panel with many different backgrounds and experiences that will be able to shed light on some of these questions that we have today. So I'd like to start with you, Dr. Zondo. Could you just give us a little bit of context in terms of what hate speech is like in post-apartheid South Africa? What are the significant issues? Where has it come from, and where is it going?
Thank you, Paul. In thinking about the topic of hate speech in post-apartheid South Africa, I'm immediately reminded that yesterday we were celebrating 28 years since the adoption of the South African Constitution. And with that, you will remember that the Constitution enshrines freedom of speech, includes freedom of the press. However, that very same freedom limits hate speech. And we cannot have instances where people think that by having freedom of speech they can then perpetuate hate. But in post-apartheid South Africa, we need to, in thinking about hate speech, we need to remember that we are a country that comes from an epoch of protracted violence, faced with colonialism, then later apartheid. It means that in that environment, hate was the discourse of the day. So essentially, in post-apartheid South Africa, there needs to be efforts to cleanse ourselves of the discourses of hate. And unfortunately, that is an area that remains a big challenge in our society. Because I'm immediately reminded of characters such as Ivan Koza, who once said to a journalist during a briefing, "You are now stop thinking like a kafir." I'm then reminded again of characters such as Penny Sparrow, who accused black beach goers of being like monkeys. This is still in post-apartheid South Africa. I'm reminded of characters such as Vicky Mambe, who just hail the word kafir as if it is nothing. Characters such as Adam Katzavelos, whom when they are in Greek islands say this is so peaceful, so nice, and there isn't a single kafir on site. Velapi Kuman, who then come and say, in fact, we need to cleanse ourselves of whiteness in the country in the same way that Hitler tried to cleanse Germany of Jews. Characters such as these remind us that if we are to rid ourselves of hate in discourse in post-apartheid South Africa, we need to deal with the discourse of hate itself. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in a situation where the conversation around the cleansing of hate is not being had enough. And therefore, these characters keep emerging not as root causes but as symptoms of the hate that still remains in society.
Can I just ask you, how do you see this having changed over the last 30 years? What is different? What kind of trajectory?
I suppose there have been many efforts to address, to define what hate is when it comes to speech. And, multiple attempts have been made to put sanctions in place to deal with hate. Hence, we have been seeing some convictions as well. I read a report from the South African Human Rights Commission, where they look at the human rights violations cases. And about I think it's about 69% of hate of human rights violations cases where majority of them still remain to be classified as hate speech. So that is where we find ourselves.
Great, thank you. That moves me perfectly on to Alan. Alan, can you tell us a little bit about how hate speech fits into the wider work that you're doing at the South African Human Rights Commission, particularly on promoting and defending human rights? And I know since over the last since the SAHRC was founded, you've done quite a lot of work on. You had this big inquiry on how to rid the South African media of racism. And you've done a lot of work on this. What has sort of been some of the most significant work you've done, and how does it fit into your sort of broader project of defending and supporting human rights?
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to just identify one thing. Because of the era that we live in, our constitution protects the freedom of expression, not just speech. So it's expression in its different ways, artistic creativity and so on. And that's important to note, right? I'll get back to why it's important to note. The Human Rights Commission, over the last few years, has noted that equality is one of the highest complaint areas it receives. In the last 5 years, so Prof just spoke about Adam Katsaveos, Penny Sparrows, and all these other cases. Those are all cases that the Human Rights Commission was involved in bringing to court to equality courts. Equality courts are specialized courts, and our statistics show us that in the last 5 years, hate speech matters have been 60% of the matters that we have taken to equality courts. That is a high amount when you have so many equality rights in this country, right? We have over 11 grounds that you can take to an equality court and more, right? So that tells you a lot. The majority of those are the K-word, right? And we're still not seeing those receiving findings as we'd like to see. So the Commission has done a lot of work on hate speech, on equality, and we continue to do this work. However, it goes beyond just protecting the right of freedom of speech and equality. It goes beyond that to the sense that you need to change mindsets and take hate out of a lot of our public, that it seems that it still remains prevalent. We are increasing the amount of hate speech that we're seeing in our country. So I think it's important that we get to the stage where we start dealing with how do we change the fact that hate is common in our society.
Can I just ask you, so you said that we're seeing an increase in the amount of hate speech. Is this based on research that you've been doing at the Human Rights Commission? Can you tell us just a little bit about it?
Yes, so I can say we're seeing an increase in the amount of hate speech being reported to the Human Rights Commission as one of the institutions which actually is able to mediate hate speech matters, is able to take them to court and so on. So definitely we're seeing an increase in that respect. And that speaks to the fact that, yes, people are more aware of the Human Rights Commission, but they're also more aware of their rights and the fact that when it's violated, they can do something about it, right? So definitely I think there has been an increase in that sense.
Thank you. I think that leads me on to the next question for Tessa, which is really about how have you seen the digital space changing how people communicate? So as Alan is speaking about this increase of hate speech, is this at all connected with the ways in which people are communicating using online platforms?
Sure, definitely. So I think for me, what's really important is to think about what gets traction, right? What gets public discourse going? And being provocative, being angry, being rude, being antagonistic is the thing that gets the people going. That's what gets traction on social media, off social media, even in the mainstream media. In fact, there are a lot of ways in which we are trying to promote anger amongst each other at times. The question that people ask me about South Africa is why we're not angry enough. And I think we're plenty angry. And I think that we are, sometimes that's like a badge of honor. Anger, antagonism, all of that becomes a badge of honor. And I think it's one that's starting to erode our sense of being able to create connections between each other, being able to have discourse and dialogue that convinces rather than opposes. So I put something actually on TikTok this week where I said part of the problem with activism is that we have a history and a legacy of resistance as activism, and that's the way where our activism ends. We resist, we resist, we resist, we resist. And we haven't gotten to a point where we're trying to convince each other. We haven't gotten to a point where we're trying to get people who are different from us to see our perspective, because there's so much currency in remaining angry and remaining dismissive. And that's not to say that there aren't things to be angry about. That's not to say that we're not living in a society that is still deeply divided, deeply racist, deeply sexist, and unequal. But it is to say that if we continue making it a currency to be angry and antagonistic, we're never going to get to the point where we start to resolve things. I think in the digital space, there's two things that have amplified that. The one is the anonymity of the digital space. And I think, you know, of the different spaces, the ability to be anonymous gives people a lot of power because there's no accountability. And I think that's a huge, huge issue. The lack of accountability on these spaces, the fact that people can say things either anonymously or without facts to back it up, and people just kind of move on. And that's the second one, is that we've gotten used to bite-sized information that we don't check. And I mean, we're going to talk a lot about the elections today, but particularly in election season, the credibility of the election is on the line because what we're reading is headlines and getting people's bite-sized takes, and we're not checking it for fact. And so people can say whatever they want as long as it's trendy, as long as it sounds radical or revolutionary, then they get that traction without actually it being factual, and that can be really damaging both to us as individuals using these spaces, but also to our body politic and the country as a whole.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think a lot of what you're saying resonates not just in South Africa, but also in other countries in terms of polarization, anger, inequality, hatred. You know, I can see it, for instance, around the upcoming elections in the United States as well. Is there anything particular that you would say is really distinctive about the online space in these issues of hate speech here in South Africa?
I don't know that this is particular. I mean, I'm sure it shows up in different places, but I think what is a big factor for us is race. And I think that we can't underestimate the role that race plays and race antagonism plays. And that's because we haven't done the work of undoing what apartheid and colonialism have done to us over the years. What we've done is we've decided to change the language that we use. We've decided to change the rhetoric around race and racism, but we haven't actually structurally undone racism. And so people feel comfortable to be racist because we still live in a society that promotes that kind of thing, right? One of the examples that I use is what I call spatial apartheid. Apartheid used geography to divide us. As a country, we've not undone that geography. And so we still live in divided, sensible, or a divided country in real terms, which is racialized. People pick up on that, and that is legitimate. But then that becomes a racialized conversation that becomes a race war. So it becomes very hard to get away from race and racism as a core part of the conversation because it's such a core part of the fabric of our society still today. Sometimes I think the thing that we didn't undo when we ended apartheid was apartheid itself, because we've changed the names of things, but we've not actually changed the way we live our lives in terms of race relations. And then the other divisions just kind of add on top of that, because we haven't actually dealt with the core fundamental question of the thing that divides us fundamentally in this country, which in the main is still race.
Thank you for that. I think this is something we'll definitely return to when we discuss also issues around xenophobic violence, for example. I would like to ask Sifiso now, how are you seeing both online spaces being used as a forum for people to sow division and also promote hate speech? Do you think that this has become an increased issue during the election period? An acceleration, that's a greater concern, for example?
So I'm immediately thinking of something now. So when does something exist? Does it exist when you see it and experience it? Or does it exist whether you know of its existence or not? The question that pops into my mind now. Hate speech, does it exist only when you experience it or when you see it or when you hear of it? Or does it exist whether you know of its existence or not? To come now to the question about the social media space, it is easy for us to say social media, amplifies or helps perpetuate hate speech. But are we making that claim simply because we are seeing it being more prevalent there? Or is it because it exists whether social media exists or not? So does it exist when we see it, or does it exist whether we do not see it? So my take on that this is a space that simply tells us or shows us what is already in existence. It is now simply finding a space that amplifies it or that shows it to others. Because, with social media, it means that we get the opportunity to be in many places at once. So you're able to experience hate speech without being in a physical place where the hate speech is happening. So that is what we see with social. That is my take on it. So I would not say it makes it worse, or it is there already. We just see it through this platform. When it comes to election time, of course, because it is a time where people feel that they need to be expressive, them to express themselves. My learned colleague mentioned that with the Constitution, of course, does not only limit freedom of speech, but it's freedom of expression, so expressing yourself in many ways. So this is a time where people feel that they need to be expressive. And unfortunately, that which you perceive to be different from you, if you feel some sort of discord towards it, chances are you will then hate it. And that is when you start to see people being hateful in their expression.
So can I ask you, do you see this interacting with the politics, like with political parties being mobilized in certain ways that's unique to this period?
On Monday, what we saw in the papers, like this past weekend, the story about one of the political parties, of course, in one of their campaigns, banning a video of banning the South African flag. This is a desecration of a national symbol as a way to pass or to communicate a certain message. Is that not a form of hateful expression itself playing out in the political realm? When we hear how during this time of campaigns, how some political parties want to portray themselves in a more positive way by discriminating those who hold different political ideas, then you start to feel that to a certain extent there is this hate that is fundamental in this campaign. And of course, not every time that what is said could be classified as being hate speech, but I do not feel the love.
Thank you for that. I think this leads to our question for Alan. One of the issues that is of a very, very deep concern in South Africa, and particularly around election time, is hate speech, xenophobia, and xenophobic violence. So what kind of trends have you seen in this area? And particularly, do you see any trends in different parts of the country, like for instance, Johannesburg or Gauteng, compared with other regions? What are the main themes and trends?
Hey, thank you. So I would like to maybe identify that the previous outbreaks of xenophobia in the country and Afrophobia were in 2008, 2012, 2016. None of those years were election-related years, right? So I think there's a tendency to be slightly fearful before an election and to almost preempt that there'll be xenophobic violence. And I don't necessarily believe that it's one of those occasions where we focus on foreign nationals in that sense. We tend to be more focused on our racial relations during elections, more so. However, we are seeing trends of it being a topic in terms of illegal foreign nationals in the country and what the activities are and the contribution are to the country. And that tends to be a very controversial approach by political leaders. I saw recently a political leader who, I won't mention their name, who had said that, for example, foreign nationals who run shops are using them for illegal activities and siphoning money and all of these things. Now, that tends to be a really dangerous generalization, because what you're saying is, for that humble person who has taken their family, moved across from their country, and legally so, and is running a shop and doing really well and integrating in society, they now have to live with this fear that someone is going to come into their shop and start asking them questions about how they use their money, and might even take it further and be violent, right? We haven't seen that happening yet, but the reality is it tends to be a dangerous kind of way to walk, or a direction to take as a political leader. So the discussion around illegality does not have to be only about foreign nationals, but it tends to be that in elections. In terms of actual violence, we have not seen a rise in hate speech particularly. So the commission cannot say that we've seen an increase in complaints around xenophobic speech or any type of hate speech around foreign nationals. And when we look at civil society also, we're not picking up an increase in violence between January and April, which tends to speak to what I'm saying, that it's not necessarily that because there's elections, there will be xenophobic violence. And obviously, as a Human Rights Commission, we don't want that to be part of the elections. So we are hopeful of a safe and peaceful elections. And I do think that South Africa is mature enough to deliver that. Thank you.
Alan, can I ask you, when you talk about these trends, though, are you mostly basing it on the complaints that are made to the Human Rights Commission, or as an organization, or also involved in monitoring online content or working with others that are doing so?
Okay, so there are several sources that I use for this. So firstly, we are using our complaints. Secondly, the Human Rights Commission is monitoring online hate speech during the elections, and we're working with several partners to track down accounts that are peddling hate speech on social media and internet platforms. Thirdly, we partner both with government and civil society on the ground to pick up in real time what you'd call hotspots of xenophobia around the country. And in all three of those, we're not seeing a huge rise in xenophobia during this time.
And Tessa, can I ask, what specific challenges do you think hate speech and xenophobia are posing, particularly for the youth, particularly for young people? Are they especially vulnerable?
Yeah, so I think xenophobia is one of those areas again where facts and misinformation are a big part of the problem, right? So it's just and the facts problem is a generalized problem in that we do have an issue where the state doesn't have the kinds of facts that can help us, can't give us the clear numbers about how many people are in the country in terms of people who entered legally but now have had their documents lapsed, for example. And that's not necessarily a them issue. It could be an issue around the state's competence and their ability to get people documents passed through. But that's not part of the conversation. The conversation is just illegal foreigners or people who are here legally but now are being harassed on the basis that there's just a broad narrative that everybody who's here who's not from South Africa is here illegally. There's also a class and race dimension to the questions around xenophobia, where xenophobia has been about targeting vulnerable people. And I think that's been where I think the difficulty for me has been. Young people in South Africa particularly find ourselves, or themselves, I'm no longer a young people, so, but find themselves in a vulnerable set of circumstances in general, right? Young people bear the burden of our unemployment crisis, our poverty crisis, our inequality issues, our social ills more than anyone else. So young people are vulnerable in general. So when a question comes up about another group of people that are seen as as antagonistic, as not contributing, or there's a narrative that's negative around people of our, the response is going to be to attack vulnerable people as well. And that ends up being other black people, people from other African countries, poor people. It's not going to be an attack on the, what are they called? The digital nomads on Clifton Beach. Those are not the people who are going to suffer xenophobia. The people who are going to suffer xenophobia are going to be particularly black, brown, and poor. And I think that doesn't help us. It doesn't help us find solidarity amongst each other, especially as vulnerable groups of people. We're not looking at ways that we can get together. We are in what I call oppression Olympics. We are all trying to show that we are the most oppressed so that we can get the help the soonest. But I don't think that's a helpful way to go forward. I think that it's a way that actually finds us fighting the wrong people for the right reasons. Yes, we are all sitting in a situation that needs to be better, a country that needs to function better, and opportunities that need to be granted to people. But when we are fighting people who are equally oppressed, we are not actually solving the problem, we're creating more problems.
Thank you. Very well said. Can I turn over to Alan just to follow up on this? How are we leaning on existing mechanisms? What mechanisms are using to try and curb in xenophobia?
Okay, so I suppose when we approach societal ills, you have different mechanisms you can use. You can use mediating mechanisms which try and resolve a conflict between two people, right? Or between two communities. And obviously the Human Rights Commission has trained mediators who try and mediate between people that violated rights and those whose rights have been violated. And that is the same with foreign nationals or xenophobia. You then can take a more strict and punitive approach where you go to the courts and ask them to make a ruling against the person because they've said something. So for example, you remember Katsuvaros, you've gone to court and asked that the court ask him to pay an amount because he said 1, 2, 3. And obviously we are able to lean on that. And I think it's important to understand that individuals can do that themselves. They don't necessarily need the Human Rights Commission to assist them in the equality court. They can walk in and represent themselves. And it's supposed to be easy for an individual, if you're not a lawyer, to do that, right? And then thirdly, I think the important thing is that we are not curbing, I think that we're not combating something that is visible, you know? We can't change that. You can't punch someone to thinking differently. You understand? We need to take an approach that is more positive and reinforces a positive mindset. And that's an area where we lack as a country. So what I'm talking about is education and awareness. Being able to deal with the pain that people have, because often hate comes from pain. You understand? I have a past where something has happened and I have this real pain. Or it comes from some kind of misunderstanding or stereotype, right? And in both cases, you require a change in mindset. You require an approach that completely takes that away, and you're able to create an open space where people can engage. And I think when Tessa spoke about our spatial geography, I think one of the things that it robs us of is the ability to have spaces to engage openly, where we can speak maturely and still offend each other, but come to an end where our understanding has grown. So I think all three of those give us an area where we can make a change in our country when it comes to hate speech. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Tessa, just following up on the creating spaces for people to engage, what are your thoughts on how individuals, creators, civil society organizations might already be playing a role in promoting peaceful coexistence as well as combating hate speech, and what are the new potential spaces as well for them to do so?
Sure. So, a friend of mine who's now passed, Eusebius Makaza, always used to say, the function of a democracy is to be able to deeply disagree but still move forward. And remembering that we are still going to have to deal with each other tomorrow is a really good way for us to figure out how we engage constructively. Um, if I think about a country like a family, right? We have nowhere else to go. and we have no one else but each other. That's how families generally work. You realize I'm stuck with this person whether I like them or not. They're not going anywhere. And at a national level, that's actually where we are as well. We're sort of stuck with each other. And we have to figure out ways that we can have disagreements, but still move forward tomorrow and figure out the next step. And I think that there are more spaces being created for conversations that connect people at community level, particularly. I think I work in the civil society space, and there's been an upsurge of particularly young people organizing themselves at community levels, trying to get a lot more engagement and a lot more working together and a lot more opportunities for talking at that level. But I think we need absolutely more of that to happen at more visible levels. So more of that happening in the media space, more of that happening in the social media space, and not for the purposes of airing our grievances only, for the purposes of asking what is to be done. And as much as institutions are great, and having the Human Rights Commission or any institutions being the place that we go to with this, I do think that outside of the institutions, we're going to start building what I call social institutions for engagement. How do we start creating ongoing conversations, ongoing platforms, and ongoing actions for change that can happen? I think our past and the liberation movement and all of that showed us that we can be a country of people who get things done from the grassroots, whether we have institutions on our side or not. And I think we've abandoned that. We've abandoned it for us waiting for somebody else to do things, waiting for somebody else to fix it, waiting for somebody else to change it. And I think that our conversations amongst each other needs to be about, okay, that's the problem. What are you and I going to do about it? What happens tomorrow? What do we start saying differently? What do we start doing differently? And I think that all sorts of platforms, including community engagements, including social media, must be turned into platforms that ask not what is the problem, but what are you going to do about it as well. There must be a sense of personal accountability, agency, community accountability and agency, and action that comes from us as the broader South African community, and not just waiting for government or someone else to do it.
Tessa, can you just tell us a little bit more about these community platforms that the youth are creating, spaces? Are they working across geographies? Are they online? Are they offline? A few examples, I think, would be helpful.
Sure. So I'll give examples of some of the work that I do and some of the work that people in the spaces I work. So we run something called the Democracy Builder. So we do one-day workshops in communities and engage them on questions of what we think about democracy, governance, and politics. But the important part of the Democracy Builder is the section we call South Africa 2.0. And we say that South Africa is due for an upgrade, and we must be the ones that imagine what that upgrade looks like. And that's always the point at which people change in the way that they speak about it. Because then it becomes, okay, what do I actually want from the country? And that's the kind of conversation we've been trying to promote, is the question about how do we build democracy? What do we want? What is the blueprint we see for ourselves? And then we ask people to do 6-week projects. And we've done 100 democracy builders in 2 years. And 61 of the projects that have been started have actually been scaled into projects that are LGBTQI advocacy projects, education projects, projects that are linking young people to university opportunities, projects that are doing library projects that are promoting reading. So a lot of active citizenry. But even in the more kind of a space that's more around advocacy, we're seeing online for this election, there are at least 3 or 4 really big platforms. There's a platform called So We Vote that is a youth-driven platform that is trying to give young people information about the election. There's a platform that is called Civic Academy, also a young people-run platform that is doing civic engagement. There is an organization called Future Elect that is trying to encourage young people to get involved in politics. There are a number of different spaces that we're starting to create to have conversations. I've been approached by so many people, both on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, who are saying we would like to be content creators that create content that's positive around how we bring change. So I think there's a number of different kinds of spaces that are in community and outside of community that young people are driving, particularly to create change. The moment people feel like it is in their hands, they actually do take it.
Thank you for that. I'm sure that we can share the details, how to create these platforms, also Safiso, can I ask you, how have you seen the approach to combating hate speech evolve in recent years? So are there any interesting strategies that you might be able to highlight, for example?
Can I just ask a question quickly to the audience? Something that
Go
I
ahead.
want to gauge. All right. So, in the townships, you mostly find tuck shops. Okay. Where do you, how do you refer to the tuck shop owners? What do you call them? My friend. And these are your friends. Okay? So in some townships there, about my friend. Right? What is the race of about my friend? Uh-huh. So one instance. Second instance. One time my friend and his grandmother and I are driving. And then someone disturbs us on the road. And then my friend's grandmother is frightened. And she gets angry. She says, "When's Lomuntu? He's behaving like a kafir." My friend's grandmother is in her 70s. Of course, to her, this person is doing something that angers her. And later on, my friend's uncle says to her daughter, "Your hair is very tough. It's like you've got kafir hair." And then it's a joke. No, it's fine. I just put, those chemicals, soften it, and then blow your hair. And so. So it seems as if there isn't an immediate realization of words that constitute hate. It seems as if there has been a way to rationalize hate speech. And this is where now initiatives such as the ones that Tessa was referring to become handy, become important. Because we've got the legal framework to deal with hate speech in our society. The laws are there. But it's almost as if people need, number one, to be conscientized of what hate speech is. And also to work from the grassroots level in dealing with hate speech. Be it hate speech coming in the form of race, be it hate speech coming in the form of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Because silly jokes about, "What are you doing? That is gay, man." People say that all the time. It's a joke. Yeah, we've heard that being said. But there isn't an immediate realization that that is a form of discrimination that could easily constitute hate speech. And therefore, a form of public education becomes important and to become more sensitive to such issues. And that is where building from the ground up becomes important. I mean, these are the strategies that I'm thinking of, and also introducing more media literacy, in people, so that we become more sensitive and we are better able to detect hate speech. Because it comes in many ways. It comes in the form of jokes, and of course, over time, these jokes become naturalized, and it seems as if it is normal. This is how people speak.
Thank you. I think that leads us to our final round of questions here, which I hope can sort of have a positive angle in thinking about how we can build these bridges. And I'd like to start with Tessa, with if you can just please reflect on how you think online platforms and communities might be able to promote more respectful dialogue, particularly across geography or across people who have very different opinions and backgrounds. And what can different stakeholders do to support this kind of work?
Yeah, so online is a really difficult place for conversation in South Africa, just at a technical level in terms of broad participation. Just this morning, one of our organizers in Limpopo was saying to me, So we're trying to do an online campaign to promote a board game that we've done for the elections, and we've asked people to tag and post about it. So now I've got 50 young people in Toyando who can't post about it because they don't have data, and they just don't have the access to do that. So I do think we need to think about how do we promote and support people in being able to get onto online spaces if that's where we want to curate conversations. But I actually think that the divide between the online and the offline is probably the more important thing that we need to be able to do. Is how do we stop focusing only on online spaces, because it's almost become an easy place to go, but it's not necessarily a representative place of all views in South Africa because the online space is so narrow. So I think we need to be more cognizant of the fact that what's happening online isn't the full picture, and be able to make more bridges between online and offline spaces. How do we go and capture what's happening offline and bring it into the online? The voices of people who aren't going to be able to be online spaces all the time. How do we make sure that their voices are represented? I think the other part of it is that we need to be more cognizant of what we're consuming and reflect a lot more on that consumption and push back when we see people are using online platforms to be particularly antagonistic, divisive, and call that out a lot more. There need to be social consequences for people who spread misinformation, disinformation, who use platforms to instigate, not only hate speech, but also violence. I just don't think there are enough repercussions. And I think we need a lot more as communities that are online, to be able to call those things out and in, I think are incredibly important for us to create more, spaces that we can trust more online. I've gotten into many situations online where I just asked people, what are the facts here? What are the evidence you have for the things that you were saying? Who are you and why do you speak so freely on these things? I think we have to ask people to be more accountable. And as communities online, we must demand accountability from anyone who's trying to promote division, race, or division or hatred in any way.
Tessa, can I ask you specifically then, what do you think as one of the stakeholders, big tech companies, for example, what can they do to both promote and bridge this digital divide? And it's something we certainly face with our students at the University of Johannesburg as well in terms of access. And also taking responsibility for some of the content, the harmful content that's online.
Yeah, it's not only the big tech companies. So the big problems that we have are around infrastructure, right? Tech companies, comms companies, all of those are basing their spend and basing what they do based on a profit motive rather than a society motive. And one of the very early social media platforms that I won't mention because I'm trying to be PC, built themselves on the idea that they build communities. And we now know that what they do is build profits. And so tech companies need to ask themselves, and comms companies, so when I talk about comms company, we're talking about the cell phone providers, all of that, is why aren't you building infrastructure in all parts of the continent? Why aren't you making sure that people are connected? Why aren't we lowering the prices of data? Why are we putting profits above connectivity and people's ability to engage and connect? But also, when we do get onto these spaces, are we intentionally creating spaces where there's more division at the expense of social cohesion for profit or not? So I do think there are big policy conversations that need to be had about the ways in which people are profiting and monetizing the viral content that is hateful versus minimizing it.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask Alan and Sifiso, you have 1 minute to respond to this last question. Apologies about that. So Alan, if you could just talk very, very briefly about some of the strategies that human rights defenders, civil society organizations are able to use both online and offline to combat hate speech. And also, Sifiso, if you also can talk about how some of these marginalized communities who are often the targets of hate speech can be better included in the policy form discussing.
Okay. I think the one question I would like to leave people with is, where do biases start? Like, one thing we've realized is often our biases begin prior to us becoming adults. So either it's in our home environment, or it's in our school environment, or our community environment, which creates these biases that that person, because they have a disability, or because they are this color or that color, that means that they are X and Y. And I think in terms of addressing that, the strategies need to be targeted towards those areas, the households, the communities, because that's where we start with these mindsets. By the time we are here in UJ, often we already have the biases in us. So I would say that we need to target those areas. Just quickly, the Human Rights Commission has a program like this called the Social Harmony National Effort, which aims to get families talking so that we resolve the issues that start in our home before we go out into society and start being the perpetrators of violation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it becomes very, very important that the approach that must be taken is one that values participation. We need to involve the marginalized communities in policy development. We need to involve them, make sure that they are part of that process, so that, at least we are able to, there's sufficient representation from marginalized communities. Because if they're not represented, they cannot identify with the policies that are being developed. And if you do not identify with the policy, it doesn't help. And later on, we need to also create mechanisms for evaluating whether the policies that we are putting in place, whether they are working and achieving the purpose for which they are incepted.
Great, thank you for that. I think now we want to open it up to our audience. So if there's any questions from all of you, please come forward and ask. I'm sure there's some pressing questions up there. Otherwise, I'll ask another question, which is always dangerous. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, it's for Alex, right? Um, you said that there are projects, right, that are especially in spaces to call like. So now my question is, I want to know like how to take of anonymous post, like what type of
I think also if anyone else.
So obviously there's two levels of escalation. When there's a fake account, you'd first go to the platform that it's on and report it, and usually they're able to identify it already. But when there's also an element of hate speech, often it ends up being also referred to the commission. And what we do is then we try work with our partners to forensically track whose account it is. We have a case which, if you want to read up on it, is called the Tracy Zilla matter, which was an individual that was peddling political hate speech, but was pretending to be someone else. And we were able to track who the individual was through forensic tracking. So we have a lot of capacity to be able to identify people based on your IP, based on where you live, and so on. So often you will identify who the perpetrator is.
You say working with partners. Who are your partners then?
Okay, so we are working with Media Monitoring Africa, who have a platform that allows you to report fake accounts, allows you to report also accounts that are using your name but are perpetrating things, for example. But in general, also report hate speech and misinformation online, and they assist us in tracking down forensic tracking of all of these accounts.
Other questions?
uh, uh, birth page has so it has
So when I say it hasn't been undone, I mean it hasn't been undone in terms of its social expressions, right? So we've undone the institutions of apartheid. So we've undone the way the government was set up and who gets access to that through election. We've undone the fact that you have a judiciary that was, only one. So we've undone it in a technical sense. What I mean is we haven't undone it in a social sense. So we're still living socially in the ways in which you think about each other under apartheid. I think also economically, we're still experiencing it in that sense, where you have a society that economically benefits some and not others. And because our lenses and the way that we think about the world is still racialized, it then also plays itself out in terms of racial access to the economy. It's those kinds of things that I'm pointing to. So, do we have a democracy in technical terms? Absolutely. Is it one that is deep enough for us to take back power to change things socially? I don't think so. We haven't taken it far enough yet. So, for me, one of the things that we need to think about is how do we make democracy much broader and give people a lot more power in order to affect change? How do we get to demand the things that we want to change our lives on a practical day to day basis? Right now, we're sitting in a situation where if you are sitting at home, not even in a far flung, even if you're sitting at home here in Joburg, and you want something to change about your daily situation and how you're experiencing the country because it's hard for you, you feel like you're limited in how you can do that. It's only the institutions or the political parties that can do something, but we don't feel like we have a lot of power ourselves to activate change, to make things happen. And I think that's where our democracy is falling short at this point, is that our democracy is still too dependent on the institutions that other people control. And we've not given enough power and opportunity for us as everyday citizens, as communities, as families, to start to shape our society on a day to day basis. So, more active citizenry is the answer to that because it's a social issue, not an institutional one.
Alan, do you want to come in on that?
That's a brilliant answer. If you're not answered, I'm not sure. But I think maybe another to say this. There's I don't know who said this. One of the songs says, "You can take me out of the ghetto, but you can't take the ghetto out of me." Essentially, this is what Tessa is saying, that it has been done administratively. It is done, but the structures of the system remain in place.
Thank you. Okay,
Okay,
actually, so we have two questions. I'm going to take both of you at the same time.
so this is for Anna. I think we can all agree that the basic needs divided. So now I want to know with the Human Rights Commission, right? How are there any things that you guys are doing to reach those people? Because obviously with us we can just go to what you just told us now, but they're not about those people in rural areas who don't have like devices to go to those pages or something like that. Have like to go there and talk to them about it.
Hi, I have a question for Ellen. I wanted to ask, how does one report hate speech anonymously without editing as a fake account?
Okay. So the first question on reaching people. So the commission has offices in all 9 provinces, and obviously our offices are in the cities, in the big cities. And what we do in each province is we identify human rights defenders that we call human rights champions, and we work with them to go to communities. So we give them the information and the funds they need to reach communities at the most rural of levels. So I personally have gone to farms and all these different environments with human rights champions, where we sit with all of the workers on the farm and we say, okay, let's talk about hate speech, let's talk about equality, and then they start engaging with us on their realities on a daily basis. But then we're also able to engage further, right? Which is generally one of the, if I can just say, one of the problems when you reach rural areas is that there's so many problems that you can't even get to talk about hate speech before you hear, okay, we don't have water, we don't have, and then we say, okay, but let's talk about this other thing. the social side, right? Because often your bread and butter comes first. So that's the one thing. We do have the structures in place, and we're trying as much as possible to reach as far as we can, right? Um, the second question is, are you able, if I understand your question, you're asking, are you able to report anonymously, right? Okay. Yes, you are. If you go onto the Human Rights Commission website, when you're filling out a complaint form, it says, I would like to report anonymously or on behalf of another. And you can do that. You won't have to give your name, but you will have to provide significant details about what has happened and give the evidence if it's like a screen grab or a screenshot or whatever. And then the commission will be able to run with it. The commission will still meet with you, but no one will ever know, or at least they'll call you and find out, but no one will ever know that it was you that reported that hate speech violation.
One question there. In the meantime, actually, I would like to ask a question, and I can add two questions to it. We'll take a couple of them. So I think one issue that we haven't discussed on this panel is language and local languages, and particularly the difficulties that big tech companies have when it comes to moderating online hate speech in languages other than English, for example, particularly on the continent. So I would just love for all of you, and I think particularly the colleagues who are working at the Human Rights Commission and at in civil society groups, to think about how are you dealing with this very tricky issue of diversity of languages, particularly South African languages. And yes, you have the microphone now. Great.
Questions for the whole panel. How do we protect the rights of free speech, but also combat and online and offline rights?
Sorry, on either of those two questions.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to freedom of expression, a lot of people are not aware of where the line is, right? So at what point does it become hate speech, and at what point am I just expressing myself? And the work of changing that is educating people on where the line is. So for the purposes of today, I can say that hate speech is when you have taken it to a point where you're inciting violence, or you're actually creating hurt. You're hurting, like actual psychological hurt. So for example, you would have seen recently a court found that the display of the old apartheid flag, it constitutes hate speech. Their reasoning was that it symbolizes something to those people that see it. So as a person, as a black person seeing this flag, it creates such deep-seated hurt for you, right? And that's really where the line is. So if you're inciting violence and you are creating hurt or calling for real hurt, then you are now in that field of hate speech, right? But let me rather use the word harm, because hurt can be sometimes problematic. So if you are creating psychological harm, emotional harm to a person, then that is when you're becoming on that field of hate speech. But I think you see that there are times where the line is tested, especially with comedians, for example, where it's like, this is artistic creativity, and that is one of the great things of being a democracy, that you're able to test these things ongoingly. So we will see as time goes where we draw the line when it comes to comedy, for example. But generally, that's the guideline I can give you.
Yeah, I'll add to that. For me, the line is justice, not harm. Because I can hurt somebody who's being racist feelings by telling them they're racist. The fact that your feelings are hurt it doesn't make me calling your racism out hate speech, right? And so is there justice in that? Is there a sense that what we're doing when we're using that word is a call into a society that is better, that is more just, that is more equitable? And so for me, the line is justice. And what's important is for us to be able to have the conversation about what you said. So no right is absolute. No right is absolute. So you can't say, I absolutely have the right to say anything that I want to say. No, all of your rights can be called into question. And we must be, living in a democracy means the ability to have the conversation about whether you're right or wrong. So you said it, but are you right or are you wrong? That's what democracy affords us the ability to do. And so no right is absolute, and everybody needs to ask themselves, am I willing to be accountable for what I say and be publicly called to account if what I say is found to be harmful, it's found to be unjust, it's found to be making the society worse or better. What the DA did this week, for example, with the flag advert. The DA can say, well, we were just using an artistic expression. But did that make the country better or worse is the conversation that we're having now, and we're allowed to have that conversation. But it's, for me, the test is justice. And then about the language thing quickly. So for my purposes, we're never going to live in a world where tech companies are going to have the skills to do the kind of language work that is required. That's why the community has to be active. It is the work of the social community that are impacted in that language to do the work of moderating almost ourselves, and the tech companies need to be in support of that in terms of the ability to give repercussions. But I don't think tech companies are going to have the ability to do this kind of mass moderation from behind. I don't think they should try to do it in that way. They should try to do it with the community and be responsive to communities instead of trying to, behind the scenes, do things themselves.
Yes, no, I think my learned colleagues have done justice to the questions, and I agree, of course, with diversity in terms of language. It rests, the responsibility rests then with the members of the community themselves. And if you've been on Twitter, for example, you will notice how if a person is misbehaving, they get called out. It becomes that community where you will be disciplined by the community members, because one way or another, the language that you speak, there will be someone who speaks that language on the side, and then they're the ones who are most likely to then report it. It's offensive. And of course, with feelings, I agree. They can, a racist can say I am hating them. In fact, I will enjoy doing it. I will enjoy hating them. Yeah, I think from my side, yeah, that's pretty much.
I think you have the last word.
Yes, so I just wanted to clarify one thing, which is very important. Offense is not the same as hate speech, right? It's okay to have conversations where we offend each other, and I think we need to, as a democracy, we need to be at a place where we're willing to be offended and be okay to engage, and not get angry because we're offended. The point is, we need to have dialogues, and there's no way to have a dialogue where you're always biting your tongue. We need to be able to speak, right, openly. So offense is not a form of hate speech, and I think that's where Tessa was also correcting. It really does need to be harmful, and that's what our courts have said to us. On language, just quickly, we have, of course, there are several cases we've dealt with, some which I've worked on, which have been in different languages, most dominantly Afrikaans, because you have people on Afrikaans platforms, and they're engaging, and then people raise complaints about it. One, for example, would be Steve Hofmeyer last year, which related to sexual orientation, and we ended up settling the case. So definitely there's the ability to translate something, but someone needs to bring it to your attention. So as soon as it was brought to our attention, then we translate the whole thing and understand it in the context of both what it was said and the language that it was said in. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. If we can just give all of our panelists a round of applause for a fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I think now we have a brief break.